By the spring of 1945, the European war had become a race against collapse. Nazi Germany was no longer fighting for victory, it was fighting to delay the inevitable, to keep its armies from being cut apart, and to preserve enough territory and bargaining power to shape whatever came after defeat. Across the continent, the Allied coalition that had been forged in necessity was converging on the Reich from opposite directions with very different memories, ideologies, and strategic anxieties. In the West, American and British armies pushed through the Rhineland and into central Germany. In the East, the Red Army, having survived the catastrophe of 1941, rebuilt, and then rolled back the Wehrmacht through Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, and the Balkans, was driving toward Berlin with a momentum measured in hundreds of kilometers and millions of men. The meeting of Soviet and American troops was not just a dramatic battlefield milestone. It was the physical intersection of two worldviews that had temporarily aligned to destroy Hitler, and that were already preparing, often quietly and sometimes openly, to contest the peace. To understand why the first contact mattered, you have to understand what the map looked like in April 1945 and what the leaders believed was at stake. At Yalta in February 1945, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin had sketched an outline of post-war Europe, but they had not settled the hard questions of power on the ground. The Red Army was already deep inside Eastern Europe, and Soviet security thinking, shaped by the invasions of 1914 and 1941, was uncompromising. The USSR wanted a buffer zone. The Western Allies, for their part, wanted Germany defeated and Europe stabilized, but they also worried about Soviet domination of the continent. These suspicions did not appear after the war. They were present during it, surfacing in arguments over the opening of a second front, over the fate of Poland, over the composition of post-war governments, and over how far each army would advance before stopping. The battlefield in April 1945 was therefore not only about destroying the last German formations. It was about the geometry of occupation, the lines that would harden into borders, and the political leverage that would come from being physically present in key cities and regions when surrender arrived. In the West, the US Army had crossed the Rhine in March 1945, and the German front disintegrated into pockets of resistance. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen on March 7, 1945, gave the Americans a foothold across the river earlier than expected, and the subsequent Allied crossings turned the Rhine Germany's historic defensive barrier into a logistical problem rather than a strategic wall. By early April, American forces were moving quickly across central Germany. The U.S. First Army, commanded by General Courtney Hodges, was one of the spearheads. It had been fighting since Normandy, through the hedgerows, across France, through the Hürtgen forest, into the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge, and now into the heart of Germany. It was an army built for operational tempo, with motorized logistics, armored thrusts, and overwhelming air support, and it was now encountering a Germany that was militarily exhausted and administratively collapsing. In the east, the Soviet advance was even more massive. The Red Army's Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945 had carried Soviet forces from Poland to the Oder River, within striking distance of Berlin. That offensive, launched on January 12, had stunned German command with its speed and scale. It was followed by the East Pomeranian and Silesian operations, clearing flanks and securing approaches. By April, the stage was set for the Battle of Berlin, which began on April 16, 1945, when Soviet artillery and searchlights opened the assault across the Silo Heights. The Soviet High Command, the Stavka, was deploying Front Army groups on a colossal scale under commanders like Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konov. For Soviet soldiers, the war had become intensely personal. They were marching through territories that had been used to invade their homeland, and they were heading toward the capital of the state that had unleashed annihilation warfare against them. The Red Army's losses were staggering, and every kilometer gained was paid for in blood, but the strategic direction was now irreversible. Between these two advancing giants lay the Elbe River, a natural line running north to south through Germany. In Allied planning, the Elbe had become more than a river. It was a practical boundary for coordination, a contact line where forces could avoid accidental engagements and where the final partition of military responsibility could be managed. The Western Allied High Command, under Dwight D. Eisenhower, had already decided not to race the Soviets to Berlin at the cost of potentially enormous casualties and political complications. Eisenhower's decision, controversial then and debated since, was shaped by the agreed occupation zones, by logistical realities, and by the desire to avoid a clash with Soviet forces in the final days of the war. Instead, Western forces were to drive into southern and central Germany, destroy remaining German armies, and meet the Soviets on a line roughly corresponding to the Elbe and Mulde rivers. For Germany, that convergence was catastrophic. It meant the Reich would be cut in two, severing communications between northern and southern German forces and making any coordinated defense impossible. It meant that units still fighting in the West could no longer retreat eastward in hopes of surrendering to the Americans rather than the Soviets, and it meant that the remnants of the Wehrmacht would be trapped in isolated groups. On April 25, 1945, that is exactly what happened. Allied forces united in northwestern Saxony, cutting German forces into two separated masses. The war was entering its terminal phase, and the map was being rewritten at the speed of mechanized columns. But the famous handshake on the Elbe did not happen by accident, and it did not happen in a vacuum. By late April, both sides expected contact and prepared for it, because the cost of misunderstanding at that moment could have been deadly. The front was chaotic. German units were fragmenting, some still resisting fanatically, others trying to break through, some disguised, some mixed with displaced civilians. Soviet troops had their own security concerns, including the presence of German infiltrators and the complexity of operating in territory saturated with enemy stragglers. American troops, pushing into unfamiliar terrain, were also wary of ambushes and of misidentifying forces in the fog of war. The meeting of allies was supposed to be a controlled event, managed by reconnaissance and liaison, not a random encounter in a firefight. Units of the U.S. First Army were the first to reach the contact line along the Elbe River. That detail matters because it tells you something about the operational tempo of the American advance in that sector and the way Allied command prioritized reaching the river. The Elbe was the geographic marker, but it was also a psychological milestone, the point where the Western soldier, who had fought across France and into Germany, would physically touch the Eastern Front, the other half of the Allied war effort that had absorbed the bulk of German military power for 4 years. The American units arriving at the Elbe were not stepping into a calm, ceremonial space. They were arriving at a river line in a collapsing state, with bridges destroyed or mined, with German fire still possible, and with the knowledge that the next troops on the opposite bank would not be enemies, but could be mistaken for them. On the morning of April 25, several American reconnaissance groups crossed to the opposite bank to search for their Soviet counterparts. This was not a casual patrol. It was a deliberate probe, the kind of small unit operation designed to establish contact without triggering confusion. Reconnaissance troops were sent because they could move quickly, identify forces, and withdraw if necessary. The Elbe itself, swollen and dangerous in places, was a barrier that demanded improvisation. With many bridges destroyed, crossing meant boats, makeshift rafts, or whatever could be found, and it meant exposing small groups to the unknown on the far bank. At 1:30 p.m. on April 25, near the city of Riesa, an American group under Lieutenant Albert Kotzebue encountered a detachment led by Senior Lieutenant Grigory Goloborodko of the Soviet Fifth Guards Army. That meeting near Riesa is one of the documented first contacts between the two armies on German soil. It unfolded not as a staged photo opportunity, but as a tense confirmation that the war's geographic logic had reached its end point. The Soviet Fifth Guards Army was a formation with a pedigree forged in the most brutal fighting of the Eastern Front. Guards, units in the Red Army, carried an elite designation, awarded for performance and often associated with heavy combat experience. For American soldiers, meeting a Soviet Guards formation was meeting the hardened edge of the Eastern War. Communication in that first contact was practical and improvised. The men did not share a language, and there was no guarantee that the first individuals encountered would have interpreters. Translator Joe Poloski later recalled that they used German as a bridge language. Kotzebue's words were rendered into English, and a Russian soldier who knew German translated into Russian for the others. That detail is revealing. German, the language of the defeated enemy, became the medium through which the victors first recognized each other. It underscores the strange reality of coalition warfare. Even at the moment of unity, the common language was not shared ideals, but the immediate necessity of being understood in a hostile environment. The Americans were invited to the location of the Soviet troops. That invitation was not merely hospitality, it was also security and procedure. Soviet units, operating under strict command structures and with a deep culture of control, would have wanted to manage the encounter, verify identities, and report up the chain of command. The Red Army had suffered from German deception and infiltration before. Caution was ingrained. For the Americans, being escorted to Soviet positions was the first experience of Soviet operational culture at close range, more centralized, more suspicious, shaped by a war in which the enemy had often fought without regard for conventional rules. Yet the meeting that would become iconic in global memory occurred a little later, in the area of the city of Torgau, also on April 25. This is the encounter that would be photographed, reported, and later mythologized as the symbolic joining of East and West. Near Torgau, groups led by Lieutenant Alexander Silvashko on the Soviet side and Lieutenant William Robertson on the American side met in circumstances that captured the tension of those final days. At first, the soldiers mistook each other for Germans. That confusion was entirely plausible. Uniforms at distance can deceive, silhouettes can be misread, and in the wreckage of late-war Germany, there were German soldiers in captured clothing, Volkssturm militia in mismatched gear, and civilians moving unpredictably. The fact that Allied soldiers could still mistake each other for Nazis on April 25 shows how unstable and dangerous the environment remained even as the strategic outcome was decided. The moment of recognition came through a shouted phrase that cut through uncertainty: "Moscow, America." The words were not poetry, they were a signal, an improvised code that declared identity and intention. In that instant, the risk of a lethal mistake dropped, and the encounter shifted from potential firefight to historic contact. The men approached each other across a destroyed or damaged bridge span, moving toward the center. Silvashko later described how they met in the middle and shook hands, with no shared language, relying on gestures and quick thinking. That handshake on the bridge at Torgau became the image of a world briefly united against a common enemy. But the handshake itself was only the beginning. Once contact was confirmed, the machinery of alliance coordination moved into place. Silvashko was called to the headquarters of the U.S. division. That detail points to how rapidly the encounter escalated from a small unit meeting to a command-level event. Both sides needed to report the contact, establish clear lines, coordinate boundaries, and prevent accidental engagements. The Elbe was not just a symbolic meeting point. It was now a line along which thousands of soldiers would face each other as allies, but also as representatives of governments with diverging post-war goals. The next day, April 26, a full-scale meeting was organized in Torgau with representatives of high command. There was a feast, formal photographs, and an exchange of gifts. This was not spontaneous fraternization. It was a controlled political ritual. By April 26, the war's end was close enough that images and narratives mattered. The Allied governments needed proof of unity for domestic audiences, for soldiers, and for the emerging post-war order. The meeting at Torgau served that purpose. It created a public symbol that could be broadcast. The alliance was real, the front was connected, Germany was split, and victory was imminent. A joint photograph of Robertson and Silvashko was taken against the backdrop of a poster reading "East meets West." That phrase captured the global meaning of what had happened. It was not simply that two patrols met. It was that two military systems, two political projects, and two social worlds had made physical contact in the ruins of Hitler's Europe. The photograph traveled through newspapers around the world. It became a shorthand for the defeat of Nazism and the promise, still plausible, in late April 1945, of a cooperative peace. The personal story embedded in that image also mattered. Robertson and Silvashko maintained their friendship for life. In a century defined by ideological conflict, their continued bond became a counterpoint to the political trajectory that followed. It suggested that at the level of individuals, the war had created real solidarity, a sense of shared sacrifice against a monstrous enemy. It also highlighted the tragedy of what came next, that the alliance, so hard won on the battlefield, would soon fracture at the level of states. In Moscow, the meeting was celebrated with a ceremonial salute of 324 guns. That salute was not a minor gesture. Soviet wartime salutes were formal state rituals used to mark major victories and milestones, and the number of guns signaled the scale of the event's importance. The Soviet leadership understood the propaganda value of the Elbe meeting. It demonstrated that the Red Army had advanced to the heart of Germany and linked with Western allies, confirming the USSR's central role in the defeat of Hitler. It also reassured Soviet citizens, after years of devastation, that victory was not only near but internationally recognized. Yet even as the guns fired in celebration, the political ground was shifting beneath the alliance. The meeting on the Elbe occurred at a moment when the war against Germany was nearly over, but the war for the shape of Europe was beginning. On April 12, 1945, Franklin D. Roosevelt had died, and Harry S. Truman became President of the United States. Truman inherited a war in its final weeks and an alliance strained by unresolved questions. In London, Churchill was increasingly alarmed by Soviet actions in Eastern Europe. In Moscow, Stalin was determined not to allow a hostile coalition to form again on the USSR's western frontier. The Elbe handshake was therefore both a culmination and a hinge, the end of one conflict and the prelude to another. The military consequences of the meeting were immediate and concrete. With American and Soviet forces linked, German operational options narrowed to almost nothing. The Wehrmacht was now divided into isolated groups, and the possibility of shifting forces from one sector to another vanished. German command structures were already breaking down, but this physical severing accelerated the collapse. It also shaped surrender dynamics. Many German soldiers and civilians feared Soviet captivity and tried to move west to surrender to Americans or British forces. The meeting on the Elbe made such movement harder in central Germany. It trapped some units and populations in zones that would soon be under Soviet control. For the civilians of Saxony and the Elbe region, the meeting was not just history. It was the end of one kind of terror and the beginning of uncertainty. American occupation, where it occurred, was generally characterized by strict discipline and a focus on administration, though it also involved requisitions and the chaos of displaced persons. Soviet occupation was shaped by the Red Army's trauma, by a desire for reparations, by security concerns, and by the political goal of restructuring Germany's east. The Elbe Line became, in effect, a preview of the division of Germany. In 1945, few could know exactly how long that division would last, but the conditions for it were being created in real time. The strategic decisions that brought American troops to the Elbe rather than Berlin were rooted in Allied agreements and in Eisenhower's operational priorities. The Western Allies had agreed in principle on zones of occupation, and Soviet forces were already poised to take Berlin at enormous cost. Eisenhower's choice to halt major advances at the Elbe was meant to avoid unnecessary casualties and prevent incidents with Soviet troops. The decision also reflected the reality that the Western Allies could not easily sustain a deep thrust into Berlin without extending supply lines and risking confusion. But the consequence was that Berlin fell entirely within the Soviet sphere of capture, which gave the USSR immense symbolic and practical leverage in post-war negotiations. The Battle for Berlin, fought from April 16 to May 2, 1945, ended with the city in ruins and with the Soviet flag raised over the Reichstag. That image, like the Elbe handshake, would become a defining icon, but it would also harden the Soviet claim to decisive victory. The Elbe meeting also had an internal military meaning for both armies. For Americans, it was a confirmation that the European war was essentially won and that the sacrifices of the Western campaign had achieved their purpose. For Soviets, it was validation that the Red Army had carried the war to Germany and that the USSR was now an equalor in Soviet eyes, the primary architect of victory. The Soviet narrative of the Great Patriotic War emphasized the existential nature of the struggle and the USSR's decisive role. The Elbe contact fit neatly into that narrative, demonstrating Soviet reach and Allied recognition. But the alliance was already fraying, and the reasons were structural. The United States and the Soviet Union had fundamentally different political systems and incompatible visions for post-war Europe. During the war, these differences had been suppressed under the pressure of necessity. Once victory was imminent, necessity weakened, and the differences resurfaced. Poland was the most immediate flashpoint. The Soviet Union had backed the Lublin Committee and sought a friendly government in Warsaw, while the Western Allies had supported the Polish government in exile in London and demanded free elections. These disputes were not abstract. They were about who would control territory, police forces, and political institutions in the center of Europe. As Soviet troops occupied Eastern Europe, they enabled local communist parties and security services. In the West, American policy increasingly leaned toward rebuilding democratic institutions and market economies, though in practice, it also involved managing instability and countering communist influence. Even at the level of soldiers, the meeting carried both warmth and tension. The feast and gift exchanges in Torgau were real, documented, and meaningful. Soldiers who had endured years of war could recognize each other's hardship without needing a shared language. But soldiers also carried rumors, stereotypes, and the weight of propaganda. Americans had heard of Soviet harshness and secrecy. Soviets had been told that Western capitalists were unreliable and that the West had delayed opening a second front. Both narratives contained elements of truth and distortion. The meeting on the Elbe temporarily overcame these barriers because the context demanded it. The enemy was still present, the war was not yet formally over, and the immediate task was coordination. The timing is crucial. On April 25, Berlin was already encircled, and Hitler was in his bunker. On April 30, Hitler would commit suicide. On May 7, Germany would sign an instrument of surrender at Reims, and on May 8-9, surrender would be ratified in Berlin, marking Victory in Europe Day in the West and Victory Day on May 9 in the Soviet Union. The Elbe meeting sat right in the middle of this sequence, a moment when the outcome was certain, but the end had not yet arrived. That liminal timing gave it its power. It was the visible proof that Nazi Germany's defeat was not a promise, but a fact on the ground. And then, almost immediately, the military gave way to politicians, and the world moved toward the abyss of the Cold War. This transition was not instantaneous, but it was swift. In the summer of 1945, the Potsdam Conference would attempt to manage the occupation of Germany, reparations, and the political future of Europe. But trust was eroding. The United States had tested the atomic bomb in July 1945, and the knowledge of this new weapon would reshape diplomacy. The Soviet Union, determined not to be strategically outmatched, would accelerate its own atomic program. In Eastern Europe, Soviet influence hardened into control. In the West, American policy shifted toward containment. By 1947, the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan would formalize the division. By 1948-1949, the Berlin blockade would turn Germany's partition into a global crisis. By 1949, NATO would be formed. By 1955, the Warsaw Pact, the line that had been a wartime contact point along rivers like the Elbe, would be echoed in the Iron Curtain that Winston Churchill described in 1946. The symbolism of Torgau therefore became complicated. The image of East meets West was real, but it became, in hindsight, a photograph taken at the exact moment when East and West were about to separate. The officers in the photograph could remain friends, but states would become adversaries. The handshake could not stop the logic of competing security systems. the Soviet Union would interpret Western economic programs and military alliances as encirclement. The United States would interpret Soviet political control in Eastern Europe as expansionism. Each side would build intelligence networks, propaganda systems, and military plans around the assumption that the other was the primary threat. And yet, precisely because the Cold War followed so quickly, the Elbe meeting retained a unique power. It was evidence that cooperation was possible even between profoundly different systems when faced with a shared existential threat. It also served as a warning about what happens when the threat disappears, but the instruments of war remain. In April 1945, coordination on the Elbe prevented accidental clashes and helped end the most destructive war in European history. In the years that followed, the absence of a shared enemy and the presence of mutual suspicion turned contact lines into confrontation lines. The deeper context behind major decisions is visible in the geography of that meeting. The Elbe was where operational planning met political reality. Eisenhower's decision to stop at the river and Stalin's determination to take Berlin were not isolated choices. They were the product of alliance commitments, casualty calculations, and post-war bargaining. The consequence was a Europe divided into spheres that would last for decades. Saxony and the towns near Riese and Torgau did not merely witness a handshake. They witnessed the creation of a boundary that, in different forms, would shape the lives of millions. When you watch footage or see photographs of American and Soviet soldiers smiling in April 1945, it is tempting to treat it as a simple story of unity. The real story is sharper and more unsettling. Those men met at the end of a war that had demanded unprecedented cooperation, but they met at the beginning of a peace that would be organized around distrust. The Elbe meeting was prepared in advance because both sides understood the risk of miscalculation. That same awareness, fear of miscalculation, fear of surprise would soon define the Cold War, from Berlin to Cuba to the nuclear standoffs that threatened global annihilation. The takeaway is not that the Elbe handshake was naive or meaningless. It was a real, documented moment when the Allied coalition became tangible, when the Wehrmacht was cut into isolated groups and the end of Nazi Germany became unavoidable. It was also a reminder that military victories do not automatically produce political harmony. In April 1945, soldiers could bridge language barriers with German translations and shouted slogans, could meet in the middle of a damaged bridge and recognize each other as comrades. But once the guns fell silent, the questions that armies cannot answer: who governs, who controls borders, who defines security, returned with full force. The world we live in now, still shaped by the aftershocks of Europe's division and the institutions built in the Cold War, traces part of its origin to that riverbank on the Elbe, where the end of one nightmare briefly illuminated the outline of the next.